Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to be talking to you today about international organizations, and I'll be talking about the tragic heroes of international politics. Why do I say tragic heroes? The international organizations are an important column in the world order, but on the other hand, we can see that in some cases they have to fight to survive. Tragic heroes, I say, because if they are work too closely with the member states, then they are puppets of the most powerful states. But if they emancipate and work on their own, then they are accused of abuse of power. Okay, I will be talking about three major areas. I'll be talking about some examples for the disruption that we can observe in this field. Then I'll be talking, in other words, from the political scientific point of view. I'll have three major aspects that I will focus on, and this will sum up the academic situation: empowerment, politicization, and legitimacy. And this is something we heard about earlier. And then I'll be talking about adaptation or adaptability, or how resilient are international organizations. And then I will conclude with some of the major challenges. For example, what we've been observing, disengagement, that is, in other words, a withdrawal of countries, which in the final analysis can mean that at the end of the day, there is an exit, or they exit international organizations. And then I will conclude with accountability, and then we can also find a way out of the current situation we're in. Some examples make it clear what the challenges are that we're facing right now. If you take a look at the World Trade Organization as an example, you will see that the United States has torpedoed some of the most important positions there, and the functioning of this organization is in danger. Another example that we're all familiar with now is the WHO in the middle of the corona pandemic. And here, the United States and Brazil plan to leave the WHO, or have already done so. And then, if we look to the European Union, the picture there is not all that great either. The European Central Bank has saved the euro, but in my opinion, they paid a very high price to do so, because in the meantime, their authority and their expertise are both being called into question. You're all familiar with the discussions on breach of contract. And then we can also see, for the first time in the history of the European Union, where we see a process of disintegration as a result of the UK's exiting the EU. Now, to understand why we are in the situation we're in, we have to look back in history, and we have to understand what power international organizations have and how it can be measured, or if it can be measured. But before we do that, I must say it's not an easy question if you try to answer why we need international organization. what do countries expect of them? And in the post-war era, based on the experience of World War II, it was quite clear it was a question of securing world peace. But human rights were to be promoted, free trade, etc. But in the meantime, we as citizens see that these international organizations cost a lot, so we have high expectations of them. We want them to function efficiently with the funds provided to them, and that these funds are used to solve the problems they're responsible for. So if you then try to sum it all up, what do they do? Why are they important? You can say that basically they see to it that rules are adhered to, and if there is a breach of contract, then the organizations see to it that sanctions are given, and they also represent the member states in international negotiations. Think about the EU and the EU member states in the World Trade Organization, things like that. Their authority stems from the fact that they stand for continuity, neutrality, and for their expertise. And we distinguish between three types of authority in the literature: delegated, in other words, competences that are delegated by the member states, their moral authority, because they also define what a refugee is, and also the epistemic authority, their expertise. So if you look at the power they have and how can you measure international organizations' power, in my department we had a project which has just been concluded, and in this project we looked at the process of empowerment, and we tried to quantify it. We distinguish between formal and informal empowerment. Formal empowerment is always the result of a change to the agreements. Informal is what you can see, for example, in the European Central Bank or other international organizations, such as the World Bank, where new tasks are added to their portfolio. And sometimes they authorize them themselves or they expand them in a certain area. But there is no change to the treaty. And then we took a look at 6 of the major international organizations. I've shown this in a simple way here. I want to show you how complex the reality is. World Bank, we have 5 international organizations, and if you try to measure all of this data, so what we did, this was from when the 6 international organizations were founded up until today. We took a look at the budget and the staff, permanent and temporary staff, and the changes. I think that these charts show you nothing that's really all that surprising. What we see at the very bottom, that's the organizations that are underfunded, and this is GATT, WTO, and WHO. You can't expect one organization such as the WHO to react adequately to a pandemic if they're underfunded. Now, the second major phase of our studies of international organizations is politicization. What I mean by that is questioning the authority of international organizations. This began in the late 90s, and then during the Euro crisis, it increased further due to the Troika constellation and the fact that all of a sudden technocrats in dark suits interfered in the inner workings of individual countries. There are a number of different reasons for politicization. Some of them we're familiar with from reporting. For example, major bureaucracies, they're dysfunctional. There's also some cases of corruption in all bureaucracies. Then the fact that we're dealing here with executive multilateralism. In other words, social players are basically excluded. In my department, we are now in the process of taking a look at a conceptualization and operationalization of what we refer to as agency slack and how that can be measured and how you can counter it. This is agency slack in the literature is seen as something negative. We also want to see this in more neutral terms because agency slack can also have some positive side effects. I'm going to skip over that slide so I don't go over my time. The next point is if international organizations are under pressure and if they're being attacked, how do they react? There are a number of different ways to react. And an interesting example is the World Bank, because in the last few decades, in order to counter criticism, first of all, they took the NGOs and civil society. They were being opened up to cooperate with NGOs and to strengthen this cooperation and to introduce governance structures to have internal accountability mechanisms, which were introduced. And then they took on new fields. That meant that in the meantime, if you consider the interpretation of the term development, then you can see that there's a broad range of different areas. Health, and that means that what we saw at the very beginning, in other words, there was a central international organization for health. There was another one for financial questions, the IMF. All of this is in flux right now because there are different programs, development programs, financial programs, so they are interpreted in a much broader way. Now, the challenges, I will sum this up. One of the challenges is that by lack of interest and withdrawal of the nation states from the multinational arena meant that there was fragmentation in the institutional landscape and that we saw a lot of unilateralism. We also saw a rise in populism as well as what we've been talking about a lot in the last couple of days is this power shift and a change in power, so to speak. You can see this best with the WHO. Here we see global health landscape. It has become very complex because the basic funding for the WHO in the last 30 years has changed substantially. The basic funding is 20% of the budget for the WHO, and there are other players which are also involved. The Bill and the Melinda Gates Foundation is one of the strongest, but there are other partners and funders, and welcome, we can see. The Rotary Club is another example. And there is also close cooperation with pharmaceutical countries, which is not surprising because an institution such as the WHO relies on expertise from various areas. A second challenge that we're faced with is what role China plays in global governance. How does China try to gain influence? And in one area where you can see this best is something that we've seen in recent years. This is multilateral development banks. Here we have two new players here that have been set up because China was very unhappy with the way the development programs from the World Bank or the good governance rules from the World Bank were set up. And with the setting up of these two new banks that are in parallel and alternative ones, this made it possible for China to increase its institutional power. We published a paper showing that with the rise of China in this area, you can also see that the democratic factors in global governance have declined. For example, with regard to the multilateral development banks. And my last chart shows you, and that was the question that we heard in the last paper as well, and the question is, there are so many clever people out there. What policy recommendations do we have for the heads of state and government? Well, I think that one way out of the current situation can only be by means of an increase in accountability, no matter what form this takes on. And I think that if in academia, when we talk about accountability, we also refer to the dimension of transparency. Accountability, however, is much broader. It's not only a question of the transparency of our decision-making processes and access to documents, it's also a question of controllability. It's also a question of checks and balances, and this needs to work. And then, of course, this would be supranational institutions or international organizations which then are accountable to national states. This makes things more complex, I'm aware of that, but that would be a possible way out. It's also a question of responsibility, or how responsible is a specific international or supra-international institution? How do they deal with their power? And if you have a situation of abuse of power, is there a possibility to have credible sanctions? I think that, even so, if there is trust, you still need to have a possibility in the case of suspected power abuse. Then, of course, you have to be able to have effective control mechanisms, which would allow you, if need be, to take back the power that you've given them. Because we talk about the European integration and supra-international institutions, it's always a question of more power or more competence going to Brussels, but it also has to be possible for us to say, okay, also with regard to the principle of subsidiarity, there are certain areas which can be dealt with better at a national level. And this is a type of discussion that unfortunately is not happening. Thank you very much.